welcome to the State of the Nation Weekly Update. The State of the Nation Weekly Update is a new segment on the show where we aim to deal with the current news as it happens, cover what's been hot for the last week, give you analysis of that, and have a conversation. It's a shorter segment than our usual interviews, and it'll dovetail perfectly with the long-form interviews that you know and love by being a subscriber and a follower of the State of the Nation channel. Once again, brought to you by Pace Car Rental, so please go and rent a car from them. It helps us all. But each week we will have a different analyst where we will look at some factors, some segments in the news that have appealed to us, and we'll discuss them. And joining me today is columnist, radio presenter, man of many talents, chartered accountant, Mr. Khaya Sithole. Khaya, welcome to the State of the Nation Weekly Update.
Thank you, and hello to everybody.
Yeah. Right. Khaya, you wrote an article recently which was featured on MoneyWeb, talking about managing hysteria, mass hysteria ahead of voting day.
Yeah.
Now, you obviously had a sort of a big part of it was the financial reaction to some of the week's news.
Yeah.
We're talking about the rand tumbling when Jacob Zuma was announced that he could run as leader of the MK party.
Yeah.
Explain to us a little bit more there.
So interestingly, there's one dimension of it in that it was in the reporting that there was a bit of an interesting dimension in that, currencies and currency trading happens every second of the day. And obviously currency fluctuations are usually very difficult to pin down to a singular event or a singular series of events, with obviously the great exception of Des Van Rooyen, where everybody could sort of really identify that that was the key reason. So on that day, we had obviously the confirmation by the Electoral Court that Jacob Zuma could indeed stand for election in spite of what the IEC had thought. And the secondary issue was a poll that had been released. I think it was from SRF. That seemed to indicate that the MK party was going to do much better than what everybody had estimated. I think it was around 13% nationally. So obviously it was in the back of those events where then there's an article that emerges that says, oh, the rand tumbled because of that. And my curiosity there was, wait, hold on. Is it actually a fact that the currency fluctuated widely simply because of that particular story? And if it was indeed the case that the currency fluctuated that widely on the back of a single story, my curiosity was then why? Because you'd imagine that the type of people that engage in trading, I mean, you've worked in this space before, are people who actually have intimate understanding of how an economy is run, for example, and how, it sort of influences their trading patterns or whatever it is that they do. So I was quite intrigued by the possibility that there would be traders or whoever it is out there who saw that particular story and started panicking and started trading differently, because the question that I would ask them was to say, so what exactly do you think the impact of this is going to be on the longer term economic trajectory of the country? And the simple question would be, do you think that Jacob Zuma on the ballot suddenly tanks the economy overnight? Do you think that even if the MK party gets 13%, that tanks the economy overnight? And of course, what that requires us to do is to be able to answer the simple question of whether in a post-May 29 scenario where the ANC is not unilaterally in charge, I think that's the term that we want to use in order to indicate where they are above 50% and don't need anyone's help in doing anything. So is the proposition here that if the ANC requires somebody's assistance in order to govern, then that suddenly means that we are going to rewrite the entire economic playbook that we've had for the past 30 years? Because if that is the case, then obviously there might be some merit to somebody acting hysterically. But my view of it is that the ANC, whether it has to co-govern or whether it does it on its own, would be very difficult for them to suddenly abandon what their own view of what the economic model of the country or the economic playbook needs to be. And what that simply means is that whatever policies that the ANC has written over the past 30 years whatever practices the ANC is entrenched into, how we govern and how we deal with public resources over the past 30 years, those are not the type of things that you can change overnight. And those are specifically not the type of things that the ANC would simply yield on. And I think the reason they would struggle to yield on them is that they are so fundamental to the very essence of what it's done in relation to policymaking ever since it published that document, Ready to Govern, many years ago. So if the ANC believes that we should have three, forms of government, national, provincial, and local, the ANC will believe that after May 29. If the ANC believes that state enterprises need to be financed from the fiscus in one way or another, the ANC will still believe that afterwards. And of course, the question that then emerges is there a permutation or is there a range of scenarios where if the ANC has to co-govern, it then starts changing some of those long-held practices and some of those long-held beliefs? And I just don't see it happening. And I think when one tries to analyze what that article that was published that spoke about the currency hysteria, it seems to give the impression that if there is a possibility of a co-governance model between the ANC and the MK party, then suddenly there'll be a raid on National Treasury, for example. And obviously that would then justify the reaction of some traders, if indeed there is a link between those three. So I think it's a very, very strange set of circumstances that we've seen, but I think the reality is that it is very unlikely that we're going to see an entire overhaul of the country's policy orientation, particularly the economic policy orientation, because it's just so well entrenched. And more importantly, even in the completely unlikely scenario, let's say the DA government comes in and has to co-govern with someone, the idea, for example, that you're suddenly going to see affirmative action policies overturned overnight is absolutely nonsensical. You imagine that the entire process of formulating laws involves a very extensive public consultation process. Now, imagine going a public consultation process in a country with our demographics and our dynamics and arguing that we should abolish affirmative action laws. Clearly, the public reaction there would be completely at odds with that. So imagine coming back to Parliament and say, well, we've gone a public consultation, here are the comments, everyone says that we believe in this, and yet we're still overturning it. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't see it happening.
Yeah, so the bottom line here is, and I think the right word is hysteria, the hysteria of some of these wild claims that some of the parties are making. We'll come into power, we'll bring back the death penalty. We'll come into power, we'll start conscription.
Yeah.
We'll suspend the constitution. There's a whole litany of wild things that are being said at the moment.
Yeah. And an interesting part is that part of the work that we're trying to research now with a couple of colleagues is the entire, framework of lawmaking in the country and how bills are passed. So if you go and read in the Constitution, if you read from Section 75 all the way up to Section 77, the way it sort of then explains the process involved and the thresholds are required for particular things to be done, you'd imagine that some of the more bizarre claims that we hear about, the death penalty, for example, I mean, that is something that will probably require a 75% vote in Parliament. So unless this party that makes that allegation can indicate to us how they would marshal a 75%, consensus within Parliament in order to do that, then they must be dismissed. It's just simply not going to happen. But also, quite importantly, when you look at how long it takes to make laws in South Africa, it is quite interesting in that for a very long time, the ANC could literally initiate and execute a bill without having to talk to any of the parties. So as long as it obviously completed the public consultation process and as long as it passed constitutional muster, they could essentially get it across the line. But they haven't really distinguished themselves in relation to how fast they actually get laws to be passed. I think even the ones that are sitting in front of the president now, the NHI, I mean, how many years has it been? So you'd imagine that if the ANC, when it had the unilateral ability to essentially usher in the process and did such a bad job, you can imagine how difficult it will be when it has to work with alliances. And those alliances will inevitably include some very strongly held, policy and ideological positions. So that would mean that even if we are co-governing, there are particular elements that I will never yield on. So we're happy to just disagree on that. So it's not like when the ANC is co-governing with someone, then whoever it co-governs with will simply say, oh, we wanted to change all of this, and the ANC will yield and say, yes, we're going to do everything that you ask for in order for us to stay in power. Similarly, if the ANC says, oh, want to do things differently, there will be elements where even those that it co-governs with, if it needs to, will say, no, actually, we do not yield on that one because we've said to our constituency that there is one thing that distinguishes us. So I have this feeling that changing the existing policy orientation of the country is going to be remarkably difficult if even somebody entertains the idea. And I think perhaps in the first 5 years of a co-governance model at national level, you are going to see much more focus on the execution on the existing policies until somebody marshals enough support to say, actually, we think there should be an overhaul and, a revision of this, and marshals enough support to be able to get it through the parliamentary chambers, even if the ANC does not support it. And at this stage, that probably only works if the ANC is significantly decimated in May 29. And as we've said before, I do not foresee that possibility yet.
Yeah. Now, obviously, within the last week, one of the big stories has been the success. Dali Mpofu won a court case. I mean, that should be a story on its own.
No, he wins a lot of court cases, but perhaps the ones that tend to have the greatest public profile are the most difficult and the most contested cases. So I think it's quite unfortunate, but perhaps to be expected in the age of social media, that the ones that take public prominence are the ones where people are going to sort of use as a prism for analyzing a person's success or failures. I mean, I think he does a lot more work behind the scenes that you and I are probably not interested in, and his success rate is unknown, but I think, well, to us, but I think he probably does very well. Otherwise, he wouldn't be in such demand.
He wouldn't be in such demand. But he managed to get to claim a victory against the IEC, who wanted to disqualify Jacob Zuma from standing.
I would say the right thing to say is that the IEC upheld an objection based on their interpretation of the rules. Yes. So it's important for us to keep emphasizing that the ANC did not initiate a process of looking at the name and say, oh, we want you to be out. There had to be someone who lodged an objection, and the IEC said, well, the base of the objection is that whoever lodged the objection said, my understanding of the law says that anybody who has been convicted of an offense at any time after the adoption of the Constitution, I think 1996, obviously, of a particular time without the option of a fine is ineligible to stand until a particular time is passed. So the IEC said, well, yeah, actually, it looks like this is a case in which that all those boxes are ticked, and then they disqualified him. So obviously, then the Electoral Court took a different view. We do not know yet what really swayed it, and it will be very important and very interesting to see what exactly the Electoral Court's decision-making matrix, focused on before they reach that conclusion.
I'm not 100% sure in my mind that necessarily. I think for Konto Wesizwe, it was a win-win in either way.
Yeah.
Because I think they were expecting it to be upheld.
Yeah.
For Jacob Zuma to not be eligible to be the face of MK, in which case they would have ushered in another 2021 scenario with Visvin ready at the front, leading
I'm actually quite
rampaging.
Intrigued about that, because I wonder if there is a distinction between him being the face of the party ahead of the elections and him actively then seeking to go into parliament in the aftermath of the election. Because I remember the IFP, I think it was last year, where they said that even after their founder had passed away, they were still happy to use him as the face of the election campaign. So the question of whether Jacob Zuma theoretically not being eligible to go to parliament, whether that stops them from using his face on the ballot paper, I'm not sure if we've actually got finality on that, because they could simply say, well, it's just a marketing material. I don't think the IEC prescribes to people who you should put as the image of your party, or what you should put as the image of your party. So it may still be possible that even if the IEC had triumphed, they would still say, yeah, it's fine. We're just using him as the image to actually remind people that there's a party associated with him. But after the election, our intention is not to actually have him sworn in as a member of parliament. And I think the Electoral Court judgment is probably going to help us understand some of those dimensions.
Now, Khaya, let's just go to let's stay with MK just for a second, because they've been the big story over the past week. We and I would urge everybody to watch my interview with Tamulo and Lela from MK. Very good, but you can see into a man's eyes where they seem to really think they're going to get 2/3 of the vote, right? Which it's quite amazing. And you've got to say, for that to happen, the entire, let's say, multi-party charter vote would have to disintegrate, and people would then have to go to MK because they're already getting 35%. They need to pick up every other vote in the country. But anyway,
and this is probably already disintegrated.
Yeah, look, the question is, and as you referenced the Social Research Foundation's poll, we put them at around about 13% nationally. When the hysteria calms down of the court cases, you get the feeling that is their biggest marketing ploy are the court cases, is the victim card against Jacob Zuma. Speaking to them about policy, there's a lot of, let's go back to the traditional ways, this whole thing about African law versus we're neither Roman nor Dutch. Law's law. It's got a name of Roman Dutch law. It doesn't mean that you have to be Roman or Dutch to follow the law.
Yeah.
They're talking about fining people 2 cows and things like that, right now. At the moment, it's quite sexy because it's such a different language.
Yeah.
But, we've got more than a month to go. Do you think this is going to sway voters in their numbers to vote for MK?
So I went through their manifesto this week. They've improved their website quite significantly in recent weeks, actually. And, when you do read their manifesto, you can kind of see, or you can map out the profile of a person to whom that manifesto might indeed be appealing. I'm from KZN, I'm from rural KZN, and I can tell you that, those are the type of things that some citizens hold quite dearly. And I think the deference to traditional authority in particular is one example of something that we still practice. We have, jurisdictions where the hierarchy is like there's an Induna and there's a chief, and this is how we still live. So you can imagine that manifesto definitely appeals to that particular audience. And I think the very interesting thing is that the last time we spoke, it was back in February, and since then, the MK Party has actually benefited from 3 public profiling exercises that it can argue it never initiated itself, because the first one is obviously the ANC arguing that they shouldn't have been registered in the first place. So it was the ANC that actually objected to the procedures, as it were, and they lost that case. So it obviously got the MK Party a lot of public profiling, and so essentially the ANC is paying the PR costs of promoting the MK Party. So that's the first one, and it obviously got even better for the MK Party when they actually won that particular case. So that's the first one. The second one then was obviously the ongoing one of the intellectual property case, and obviously it's not really as urgent as what the electoral courts have to do, so it will probably take a bit of time for us to get a judgment on that, but it would be nice to have it before the 29th of May. So again, PR costs being paid by the ANC in order to promote the MK Party. And then obviously the third one was we could all kind of predict that somebody was eventually going to object, whether it was going to be one of the other parties or somebody else. There was going to be an objection because I think the general consensus was that, well, if you just read it on a vanilla basis, that section of the that talks about the qualification or otherwise of Jacob Zuma, everybody kind of understood that there would definitely be an objection. Whether obviously everybody was right or wrong, that's what we're waiting for. So they've benefited from just those 3 particular instances, which has really amplified their public profile. And I think obviously there's always going to be this realization that Jacob Zuma's public profile is completely undeniable. So no one can dispute that, when it comes to political mobilization, when it comes to political visibility, he has a much greater presence, is a much greater force than perhaps anyone, with maybe the exception of Julius Malema in particular instances. So you can clearly understand that it is a party that has gathered significant momentum in recent months. Now, whether that momentum translates to people waking up on the 29th of May and then saying that this is the party that I want to back, it's still very elusive. It's still very difficult and to predict. And obviously what the polls do is that they tap into the pulse of the prospective voter at a particular point in time. And the reason I say prospective voter is that, of course, there's no guarantee that everybody who engages in a poll ends up showing up at the ballot box in the first place. So it is to be expected that at a point in time when the public profiling is at its highest, then perhaps even the type of voters that others would have said, nah, I kind of don't know about, oh, actually, that sounds like the type of party that I should be going into. So it'll be very interesting to see if that poll had to be replicated, perhaps after the hysteria, as you may call it, has died down in relation to these big three issues that the MK party has been involved in, whether those same people will still sort of hold the same views, and whether when we get closer to elections, people start dissecting the granular details of exactly what is it that you're offering. Because obviously, if we kind of can trace that much later on, when perhaps the visibility is not as, driven by the ANC to be and the IEC, and also maybe there is a definitive answer on whether Jacob Zuma can stand or not, then it will be interesting to see whether that polling would yield the same results. But I thought it was surprisingly generous, because 13% national would mean that they'd have to do remarkably well in their primary constituency of KZN. And remember, KZN is also a story of the IFP's revival, and to then try and map the possibility of the MK party doing so well in that particular province that it translates to 13% at national level. A lot of things have to work well for the MK party over the next few weeks, and I'm not sure what those things are going to be.
I'd like to close up with exactly one issue that I think is the big story that's not being written at the moment, and tip for free, for your next article, and that is the almost complete absence of performance of the ANC, right? We're all talking MK, we're talking EFF, we're talking multi-party charter, John Steenhuisen taking on Rise Mzansi, etc. But the story that's just not being spoken about is the almost inertia of the ANC at the moment.
Nomvula Mokonyane and Fikile Mbalula are the ANC's greatest political mobilization assets. And obviously, since NASREC 2022, they've been deployed into different portfolios. And I have a fear that those that are now responsible for what those two used to master so well are probably not getting the same traction or the same momentum that you would have seen if Mbalula and Mokonyane were indeed in charge of that particular process. And there's also the sobering reality that perhaps the ANC's capacity to marshal resources onto, a big visible campaign is not as strong as it used to be. People have been commenting offhand that we're not even seeing their posters. And, it's a reality that they clearly aren't spending as much on this campaign as they used to do before. What is less clear and less linear is whether their mass mobilization, their door-to-door campaigns, something that they've become very famous for, whether that is as strong as it was in previous years. Because if that is as strong as it was in previous years, it means that they're actually doing the job that they should be doing, mobilizing their own core constituencies that we spoke about in February in order to show up and vote. So, but it's very clear that they, on the PR game, they're definitely not the leaders at this particular stage. They are being ambushed in particular debates. I mean, you saw Begicele this week. I think it was in Hanover Park. Even in the debates that some of the channels have had, you can clearly see that the ANC is really struggling to sort of position itself as the party of choice, because everybody starts off by saying that this is what they've done so wrong, and they're very defensive, and naturally, because you cannot run away from the reality that you've been in charge for the past 30 years. And if everybody says, oh, we're here to offer alternatives, they only have to say we're offering alternatives to what has been the decline of the state in the past 30 years, at least in political speak. So it's very difficult for the ANC these days.
Well, I've done a few events which have been on the channel, and I think that certainly from my analysis, the thing that comes to my mind is that the ANC has completely lost the respect of people. And that's a terrible thing. It was a trump card when people would treat them with a certain amount of deference. That seems to be gone. People are now quite, as you refer back to the Hanover Park, which I'm sure many people have seen on social media, where people are not scared. Even go back a few months, Ian Cameron, white guy, picking up a microphone and calling a minister a liar. People would never consider doing that before, just purely because it would look so bad. Now we're all prepared to do it. Khaya Sithole, thank you for joining us for the first episode of the weekly update. To everybody that enjoyed this, we'll be back with a different analyst next week. And stay tuned for more weekly updates. Khaya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I've already been fired after one episode. Thank you.
You'll be back. Don't worry. Thank you all.